This video has been created to help civil society ask questions of those who oppose climate change policies on the basis of excessive costs, loss of jobs, or harm to the economy, to ask questions that will help expose the obvious ethical and moral problems with these kinds of arguments. The video will begin with an explanation of features of climate change that demand that it be understood essentially as an ethical and moral problem. The video will end with questions designed to help expose the ethical and moral problems with arguments against climate policies based upon cost.
Climate change has certain features that demand that it be seen, understood, and responded to as an ethical and moral problem. The reason why this is so important for policy is that other justifications for not protecting the environment that may work for other environmental problems do not work once the ethical and moral dimensions of this problem are understood. For instance, policymakers in setting environmental policy may not only look at their own nation, they have to understand the duties and responsibilities and obligations to people around the world. One of the features of climate change that demand that it be seen as a moral problem is that it's a problem caused by some nations and some people in some parts of the world that are hurting and putting at risk other people and other nations who have done very little to cause the problem.
This slide depicts the amazing separation between those countries that are mostly responsible for climate change, depicted in dark gray, and those poor countries most vulnerable to climate change, depicted in red. The second feature of climate change that demands that it be responded to as an ethical and moral problem is that the harms to the victims of climate change are not mere inconveniences, but catastrophic harms from floods, droughts, destruction of water supplies, rising sea levels that will destroy cities, and destruction of ecological systems on which life depends. A third feature of climate change that demands that governments respond to it as a moral and ethical problem is that the victims of climate change who are most harshly impacted and have done little to cause the problem can't do anything to protect themselves. Their best hope is that those countries and people most responsible for climate change will acknowledge their ethical duties to not harm others.
For well over 35 years, opponents of climate change policies have made mostly two kinds of arguments against climate policies. One is there's too much scientific uncertainty to warrant action, and two, climate policies simply cost too much. They will destroy jobs, reduce national GDP, or impose unacceptable economic costs on society. This video identifies questions designed to put light on the ethical and moral problems with the cost arguments. A later video will identify questions designed to expose the ethical and moral problems with the scientific uncertainty claims.
The following 9 questions are designed to expose ethical and moral problems with the most common arguments made against climate policies on the basis of cost or economic impact. Each question responds to a slightly different way the cost arguments are frequently made, such as climate policies cost too much, they will destroy jobs, or climate policies are unfair to the country adopting them unless other countries reduce their emissions accordingly, or the policy is not justified on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis. Experience with these questions demonstrate that opponents of climate change policies will most often not answer the questions asked and try to change the subject. We strongly suggest that the questioner persevere until the person being asked responds to the specific question being asked. We also recommend that if possible, particularly if the person being questioned is an important politician, to document the responses, ideally if possible by a videotape. At the end of this, we will explain that ethicsandclimate.org will be attempting to collect experiences with these questions in the future. The purpose of asking these questions is not simply to convince the opponent, but to help civil society understand why these arguments are deeply morally and ethically flawed. This question should be asked of someone who opposes climate change policies on the basis of costs, job loss, or harm to the economy. The question is, do you deny that high-emitting nations not only have economic interests, but also duties and obligations to nations and people most vulnerable to climate change impacts to not harm them by causing climate change damages to health and ecological systems? As we mentioned before, the opponent may try to duck this question, but we encourage you to persist until you get a response. All of the questions are designed to get the opponent to acknowledge that nations not only have economic interests, but they also have duties and responsibilities and obligations to not hurt others. Those that are claiming that they don't have to adopt climate policies because it will harm their economic interests are violating the golden rule, a rule which is widely supported by almost all ethical theories and religious systems, that I can't do something simply because it's in my interest. I have a duty to refrain from hurting or harming other people who have not consented to the behavior that will harm them. Second question is very similar to the first. Do you deny that high-emitting nations not only have economic interests, but also duties and obligations to nations and people most vulnerable to climate change impacts to limit their greenhouse gas emissions to their fair share of safe global emissions? Third question is a variation on the first two, and the question is, in claiming the costs of climate change policies are excessive, have you considered the entire value of harms that will be caused by non-action on climate change? The next question is designed to get the opponent of climate change to acknowledge that nations already have duties to pay for the cost of their pollution. The question is, do you agree that nations who emit greenhouse gases at levels beyond their fair share of safe global emissions have a duty to help pay for reasonable damages inflicted on low-emitting vulnerable countries and individuals who have done little to cause climate change? Again, this question is designed to force the opponent to acknowledge that polluters have a duty both as a matter of morality and law to pay for damages that they cause. When opponents of climate change are forced to admit that they have obligations and duties, not simply economic interests, they frequently claim they're still not going to do it because it will make no difference if a nation reduces its greenhouse gas emissions and other countries refuse to do so. This claim is false, and therefore the question is, are you aware that it's not true that if a nation reduces its greenhouse gas emissions and other countries do not, it will make no difference in reducing climate threats? This is not true because atmospheric concentrations are already harming some nations and people, and any nation's greenhouse gases will force atmospheric concentrations to rise, making the problem worse. So it is simply not true that it will make no difference if one country reduces its greenhouse gas emissions and other countries fail to do so.
The question should be aware that this claim that it will make no difference if a country reduces its greenhouse gas emissions is frequently made by opponents of climate change.
This question is designed to respond to the "it makes no difference" claim by making opponents acknowledge that some countries have more responsibilities than others, despite what other countries do. The question is, are you aware that most developed countries, such as the United States, Australia, Canada, and most EU nations, are much more responsible than most developing countries in terms of per capita and historical greenhouse gas emissions for raising atmospheric concentrations to their current dangerous levels? The last question is designed to deal with another common cost-based argument against climate policies, namely that the policy fails to pass a cost-benefit analysis. There are numerous ethical problems with the use of cost-benefit analysis for this problem. This question is designed to get at one important common problem, namely the failure of cost-benefit analysis to deal what procedural justice would require of those causing the problem. The question is, are you aware that those who will be harmed by climate change have a right to A, consent to a nation's refusal to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, particularly when significant harms will be experienced by them if other countries don't act. B, demand that cost-benefit analysis consider all potentially catastrophic harms to vulnerable people that could be triggered by non-action. C, they have a right to demand that those most responsible for climate change agree to pay for the harms that will be caused by them when they refuse to act on the basis of cost-benefit analysis. And finally, that they have a right to make sure that how harms and benefits will be distributed be considered and displayed when the cost-benefit analysis is in fact calculated.
Copies of the questions on this video can be retrieved from the project website, which is ethicsandclimate.org, under the tab Index and Start Here at the top of the website, under the category Questions. We also wish to hear from anyone using these questions about your experiences, and we ask you to contact me at dabrown57@gmail.com, my email, which will appear on the scroll which follows now.